Do you believe places can hold secrets? Not the kind locked behind walls or buried beneath floorboards, but the quieter kind. Secrets that drift between dust motes in slanted sunlight, that hide in the hush between page turns, the kind that wait patiently on windowsills, watching the world pass by. If you've ever stepped into a small-town bookstore on a rainy afternoon, you might know exactly what I mean. There is something peculiar about such places. Time seems to move a little differently under low ceilings and creaky floorboards. Rain taps against the window panes like it's asking to be let in. And every corner carries the scent of parchment, binding glue, and perhaps a whisper of pine from candles flickering behind the counter. These are not simply stores, they are sanctuaries stitched together with memory and paper and long-forgotten dreams. This story begins in a place like that, a small, independently owned bookstore with worn rugs and overstuffed armchairs, where the clock above the poetry section always seemed to run 5 minutes slow, and no one ever minded. A bookstore called Willow and Fern. The town around it isn't the kind that appears on maps unless you're from nearby. Nestled along a quiet waterfront where fog rolls in each morning like a quilt unfolding across the rooftops, and the cobblestone alleys echo with the soft conversation of seagulls and early risers. Mornings come slowly here. Life does, too. But this isn't a story about the town. Not really. Nor is it only about the bookstore, though it plays its part. No, this is a story about a creature silent at first, soggy-footed and suspicious, who slipped in one day from the rain and never truly left. You may have never noticed him that first winter. Most didn't. He was a shadow among bookshelves, a sigh in the air. Just a ragged little thing with matted fur and wary eyes, too proud to beg, too tired to run. He had no name, no collar. Only stories carried in the mud on his paws and the burrs tangled in his coat. He didn't belong to anyone, or rather, nobody yet belonged to him. But that was about to change. He arrived during a November rain, one of those heavy silver-curtained downpours that seems to soak even the light. Most people had long since hurried indoors, leaving behind steaming coffees beside foggy windows and fleece scarves stretched over worn-down radiators. The smell in Willow and Fern that day was gingerbread tea and the sharp cut of new shipment boxes being opened. Somewhere, someone played Vivaldi too softly to name the piece. And outside, a cat watched, steady, still, not quite certain what he was waiting for. At first, the door stayed shut. The rain kept falling, but this story, like many old legends and quiet miracles, begins not with a bang but a whisper. One act, half-conscious, made not with intention but with instinct. A door cracked open, just slightly. A saucer left beside the returned books bin. A square of fleece laid in a cardboard box behind the biography shelf. Nothing was said. No introductions were made. Yet the invitation hung in the air. Over time, slowly, quietly, he entered. Not all at once, not in bold strides, but in pauses, in moments, in breaths held between heartbeats. A paw, then a tail, a retreat, then another try. Even now, if you press your ear close to the spine of an old novel shelved near the travel maps, you might still catch the echo of that first step inside. This is not just a story about a cat. It's about corners of the world we forget to look at closely, about second chances and softened hearts. It's about how home isn't always four walls and a welcome mat. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in wet fur, carrying a stubborn silence and eyes that seem to have seen more than their share. Because sometimes love doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it just pads lightly across the floor, curls up in a sunbeam, and closes its eyes, trusting, for the first time in a long while, that it is safe. So, if you are gentle and quiet and patient, come closer. There is more to tell. The town wakes slowly, stretching beneath woolen cloud cover and the low, lonesome call of gulls drifting over the harbor. The cobblestone streets still shimmer with last night's rain, and puddles reflect the crooked chimney lines of red brick buildings as though trying to remember them. It smells of salt, coffee, and chimney smoke in the hush of early morning. Before the bakeries, bells chime their first greeting and the postman begins his practiced shuffle. The alleys are their own sort of kingdom, hidden between storefronts, and back stairwells run narrow corridors, lined with empty flower pots, soggy newspapers, and secrets of their own. In one such shadowed path, wet leaves scatter like footprints in retreat, and just beyond the rim of a rusted drainpipe, a pair of eyes glow grey-blue in the half-light. Still, patient, he doesn't have a name, not yet, but people start to notice him all the same. Some call him the stray or the bin cat, a flicker of black and white fur darting between trash cans, vanishing beneath old porch chairs, perching on the low walls that separate yard from yard like a quiet witness to the town's quiet routines. He comes and goes like smoke, never close, enough to pet, never far enough to forget he's there. He's a tuxedo cat, or at least would be if life had left his coat untouched. His chest still glimmers white beneath the grime, a half-grown bib amidst a sea of soot-colored fur. His ears bear the small nicks and rips that speak of alley rivalries and nights colder than they should be. He's thin, not grotesque, but lean in the way of something that has never known excess. His ribs flex beneath his movements, and his tail, swaying low, always seems one breath away from disappearing. Twice a week, the garbage truck startles him from a mid-morning nap taken on top of heating vents or beneath sagging cafe umbrellas. He's seen pawing at pizza crusts left in damp boxes, peering into coffee cups left outside by patrons who thought the morning was warmer than it was. He prefers spots sheltered from wind, tucked behind cracked crates and forgotten planters. There are nights he doesn't move for hours. The first time someone from Willow and Fern notices him, it's in passing. A customer named Joan spots him from the corner of her eye while returning a borrowed umbrella. "Thought I saw a little bandit by the recycling bin," she mentions to Margot, the owner. Black and white looked soaked through. Margot nods, without much thought, murmuring something about how cats come and go around here. But the next day, the cat is back, curled between two cardboard boxes by the bookstore's delivery entrance. He doesn't run when spotted, doesn't come closer, either just lifts his head, blinks once, and returns to watching. He is not friendly. Not yet. Margot starts leaving a shallow dish of water, just in case. It goes untouched the first night, emptied the next. She doesn't mention it aloud. By the third week, the cat has become a fixture, observed more by his absence than presence. On mornings when he isn't spotted, customers ask about him. "I think I saw him in Mrs. Castor's garden," someone offers. "He likes her lilac bushes." Another swears he wandered through the post office, tail high, like he owned the place. Rumors bloom like ivy. He seems particularly drawn to the corner where the Willow and Fern bookstore rubs shoulders with a tiny adjoining Café Roserins. It's there, in the little stone nook between their buildings, that discarded croissants and muffin crumbs fall most frequently. The cafe staff, seeing no harm in it, begin leaving end pieces of sandwiches closer to the alley wall. The cat does not thank them. He does not purr. He does not linger in gratitude. Instead, he eats quickly, always with one eye cast over his shoulder. The slightest unfamiliar step sends him bolting. The flinch in him runs deep, like he expects kindness to cost something he can't afford to pay. And yet, week by week, he returns. Children begin to glance down alleyways as they pass. One leaves a tiny fleece scarf on the wall where they last saw him. It is gone the next day, whether taken by wind or paw. No one knows. A regular named Hector swears he once saw the cat sitting atop a stack of delivery boxes, like command central for pigeon monitoring. One November morning, around the time when commuters have just stepped into buses and dew still clings to bicycle seats, a man walking his dog briefly blocks the alley path. The dog tugs once toward something in the shadows and whines. When the man tugs back, the dog reluctantly follows. But for a flickering moment, the man catches sight of green eyes reflecting uncanny intelligence from behind a discarded basket. The eyes hold his gaze not with fear, but something altogether harder, resignation. By now, locals have stopped calling him that cat. They know better than to set out hands. But they leave gifts, just the same cheese cubes, muffins torn into manageable bites, bits of sausage in tissue paper. He samples some, sniffs and ignores others. Never enough to be called familiar, just enough to be understood. A few days later, as Margot unlocks the rear door to receive a delayed shipment of vintage poetry books, she spots him again, perched on the ledge, tail curled around his feet like punctuation. He doesn't move, doesn't run, only watches. A light drizzle starts to fall, the kind that glazes rather than soaks. A hush slips over the alley, like the world has paused to consider what happens next. Margot pauses long enough for their eyes to meet. She leaves the door slightly ajar, gesture neither grand nor theatrical, just wide enough for a breeze. Just wide enough for a choice. And the cat, that scrap of fur and fatigue and fierce survival, remains still, watching. No one knows his thoughts that day. No song marks his coming. No triumph shouts his name. But something, perhaps, settles into place. A whisper of yesterday curling into an unexpected tomorrow. Not an ending. Not yet, but something beginning. The rain had been falling since morning, though no longer in sheets. Now it drifted, a quiet conversation between sky and town, a gentle tapping against the awning above the back entrance to willow and fern. The alley smelled of wet stone and cedar mulch where old planters lined the wall. Margot, sleeves rolled, was shelving new arrival second-hand paperbacks with curled covers and a smell only time could create. When she glanced up and caught sight of the cat again, same place as before, just beyond the crates, watching. He looked worse that day. The drizzle beaded on his fur, slicked down his whiskers, and dampened the scruff around his tail until it clung to his bones. But his eyes were dry, steady, resigned. It wasn't sickness she saw in him, though he seemed close to exhaustion rather. It was the weariness of something waiting for rejection long enough that it no longer feared it. There was no plan in her mind as Margot moved, no grand gesture of hospitality, simply habit. She wedged the back door open with the end of a worn-out broom handle, a subtle offer, not a welcome, not yet. On the edge of the return cart, just inside the threshold, she placed a shallow saucer of warm milk steeped with a pinch of chamomile left over from story hour, and beside it, a torn piece of rosemary focaccia wrapped in a paper towel. She did not call out. she did not wait. Instead, she returned to sorting the new arrivals without a word. Though every sound registered the fall of raindrops, the creak of floorboards, the hush of unnaturally patient silence. Through the half-cracked doorway, the cat watched and left. The milk remained untouched until nightfall, when a neighbor's calico passed through and lapped at it, unbothered and unaware of its intended recipient. But the next day, the focaccia was missing, gone without a trace. The paper towel damp with a single muddy paw print curled at its edge. He didn't return for 3 days. Then, only at dusk. The door stayed ajar for 7 days in a row, never wider than a whisper. The saucer was refilled each morning. Some days, Margot found scratches in the gravel beside the threshold, or fragments of crust left under the bench. Other days nothing. But she kept at it, because something told her it mattered. That silence was a kind of dialogue of its own. On the 8th day, she saw him closer. He had stepped inside, not fully only, his front paws crossed the threshold, while the rest of him hovered in the world of retreat, but it was inside just the same. He stood like a statue in the doorway, considering the smells. Paper, cinnamon, lavender, polish on well-oiled floors. Somewhere, a grandfather clock ticked, 2 minutes behind the hour. Behind him, the rain started again. Softer this time. He turned and disappeared before anyone else noticed. But that night, Margot left an old fleece blanket in one of the boxes behind the travel section. She did not speak of it. She didn't need. 2 small things began to shift after that. A day would pass, and there'd be a new paw print in dust along the edge of the history shelves. An empty dish moved just an inch left. Bookmarks that had been scattered now seemed slightly rearranged. Nothing drastic, nothing wild, but signs of presence. Signs of testing, the way a wary heart presses gently on the walls of safety to see whether they hold. A week later, a customer named Althea asked, "Did I just see a cat slip around the corner here?" Margot lifted her eyes briefly from the till and said, "Possibly." Althea smiled and let it be. The next time he came through the door, it was earlier in the day. The store was quiet, just the rustling of newspaper from an elderly gentleman parked in the corner with an espresso, and the friendly grumble of the radiator. The cat moved with purpose then. He sniffed the baseboards as though testing the way. The air moved inside, stepped lightly down the center aisle, tail low but not tucked. He paused at every turn but didn't retreat. Margot, dusting near the back, watched him cross in front of the cookbooks and vanish between 2 boxes of unsorted photo albums. She said nothing in the children's section later that week. A toddler looked up and giggled at something unseen between the beanbags. "Kitty," she cooed. Her mother bent to look, but found nothing. Only a missing string from the story. Rug and a warm dent in a pillow that hadn't been there moments before. Soon, he began choosing unlikely places to rest. A sunbeam caught just right on the floor near the travel atlases, the top of an old stool by the decorative journals, the windowsill beside regional history where a woolen throw was always folded just so. No single spot became his. He cycled through them as though guarding each in turn. Booksellers took to speaking more softly out of habit. People lingered longer near corners he frequented, watching the shelves but listening for past steps, and a kind of hush already present in all. Bookstores took on the sacredness of intention. He never made a sound, not even when he met someone's eye. He would hold their gaze for 1 heartbeat, maybe 2, then flick those mismatched pupils away, as if to ask whether they deserved to see him at all. Every now and then, a customer would catch a glimpse and start to point or call out. But Margot always, nearby, would raise a finger to her lips and whisper, he's still deciding if he trusts us. And that seemed enough, because trust, in its earliest form, is not a loud arrival. It's the quiet choosing, the decision to stay. And in corners of the bookstore, in the dust beneath poetry shelves, in the places people rarely noticed before, the cat had started choosing, not all at once, but in small, resolute moments. A flick of tail before dusk, a low stretch at closing time, a retreat not toward escape, but toward somewhere just outside view, but still inside the walls, and always watching. He didn't come in every day, at least not at first, but something about the things that had once only been pauses, brief visits, wary glances, had shifted into something slower, something more deliberate. On quiet mornings, when the bookstore doors were propped open to let in the smell of ocean air and fresh muffins from Rose Wren's cafe, he'd appear, sometimes on the windowsill, framed by curling ivy, sometimes behind the display cart, the one with the rotating staff picks and forgotten paperbacks offered for 50 cents. In these quiet re-entries, he didn't ask for notice, and none was given aloud. Margot began calling him Hemingway, half serious, half in jest. Not because he reminded her of the writer, particularly, but because it felt right, something observational, solitary, a little storm-worn. Still, she never addressed him directly with the name, not really. Hemingway existed among whispered references and scrawled notes between staff members. Hemingway was on the rear windowsill this morning, looked content. Or, don't move the knitting basket, he's taken to hiding there around lunch. Customers started calling him other names. Paperback, for the tufted fold of fur on his back that looked like a turned-down book corner. Dust paw, after the smudges he left across the flooring. Chairman Meow, courtesy of an irreverent teenager who claimed the cat judged her taste in fiction. But none of these names stuck the way his presence did, and presence it became something you felt, even when Hemingway wasn't in plain sight. Just knowing he might be nearby lent the air a particular hush, a tension softened by curiosity. Some patrons leaned down to peek beneath the armchairs, patient as monks. Others brought offerings: potato chips in a paper napkin, sliced turkey, a pinch of fresh catnip in a muslin pouch. Hemingway accepted few, ignored most, and occasionally buried the most expensive ones beneath loose rug corners, as if politely declining a gift. It wasn't long before he began joining story time. Not centrally, not curled at laps as one might expect. Rather, he'd lay just beyond the ring of folding chairs, chin rested on paws, eyes half-lidded while toddlers turned cardboard pages and parents tried to wrangle attention spans. On windy days, when the storefront shivered with gusts from the harbor, he'd curl near the heat event behind the YA fantasy section, his tail twitching to some unseen rhythm beyond the reach of human comprehension. He never sought the spotlight, but it found him nonetheless. One afternoon, after sitting at the front desk for 20 solid minutes, just long enough for staff member Theo to joke, "Looks like Hemingway's supervising returns." Now, a young couple asked if he was the owner's cat. Margot smiled and said, "No, he just chooses to be here, which makes us lucky." There were occasional disagreements among the staff as to whether they should make things more official by a cat bed, a name tag, a dedicated dish. Margot resisted. "This isn't about ownership," she said, wiping her hands on an apron one fall morning. "It's about letting something be. Still, changes cropped up, organic, inevitable. A small basket filled with soft cloth appeared behind the travel section, almost always warm to the touch whether or not a cat was in it. A scratched sign was taped to the biography shelf. Please don't rearrange the bookmarks. Hemingway did that. And near the till, tucked behind a ceramic pot of pens, a framed photo was placed. Margot, Laurel from Rosewrens, and Hemingway, inscrutable as ever, perched regally atop a dictionary stack. Beneath it, the caption read, "Employee of the Month." Every month, the impact, subtle at first, began to ripple outward. Children brought crayon drawings of the book cat, full of swirled fur and oversized eyes. Some depicted him reading. Others crowned him in laurels. One, now laminated and pinned to the community board, showed him flying cape trailing behind, paws extended forward like a heroic guardian of bedtime tales. More people started dropping in, not for a specific title, but just in case the cat was there. "I heard he likes the windowsill on rainy days," one elderly man whispered as he browsed cookbooks, never lifting his gaze. A local journalist came by for an unrelated feature on independent bookstores, stayed 2 extra hours, and snapped. A picture of Hemingway sprawled across the discount bin like a long-lost emperor. That single image earned a sidebar in the Sunday paper, captioned simply, "A sitting of great literary importance." The store's social media page, seldom tended and sparsely followed, saw a spike when someone posted a video of Hemingway batting at a trailing bookmark ribbon with a dignified kind of hesitation. Comments rolled in. "This cat's got better taste than I do. Is he available for book recommendations? That's it. I'm road tripping just to pet him." Children began bringing their parents into the shop not for books, for a chance encounter. Regulars started treating him as a touchstone for luck. Saw Hemingway and found the perfect copy of Walden, a note left inside the book swap basket declared. One day, a tourist left behind a wool mouse toy tied with twine and a note that read, "For the feline curator, may your stories never grow old." Even the air inside Willow and Fern seemed to change. The corners felt watched, but never intruded upon. A sense of gentle curation settled across the displays, as if guided by an unseen paw. One afternoon, a teacher donated a few dozen graphic novels to the shop's free shelf and added, as an afterthought, "He likes the ones with fish, I think." No one questioned who the he was. Hemingway himself remained predictably unpredictable. Some days, he'd vanish for hours, maybe longer. On others, he appeared as soon as the key turned in the front door's lock, yawning like he'd been there all along. The staff learnt not to expect him, but to receive him like a poem no one recalled writing, but everyone recognized as true. One evening in early spring, a small celebration unwound inside the bookstore to mark its 30th year since opening. Locals gathered for tea and cookies shaped like stacked books and the silhouettes of cats with curling tails. There was laughter, readings, cascading conversations drifting like flower petals across the carpeted floor. Hemingway appeared near. The end perched atop a crooked display of antique atlases, tail high. Unmoved by the attention, Margot raised her teacup toward him and whispered, just loud enough for guests nearby to hear. To our unexpected Kona. They toasted Dot, and Hemingway blinked once, turned in a slow circle, and tucked himself into a loaf-like, sprawling, unbothered artifact of grace amid crinkled paper, whispered stories, and the scent of lemon tea. That night, after the shop emptied, and the lamps were dimmed to their low glowing, Even the wind seemed to hush its clatter. The sound of soft paws could be heard circling once, then again, before settling beneath the poetry section in a silent hello to the dark dot in that curled shape. Beneath worn wooden shelves and a collection of used anthologies, Hemingway slept deeply, fully as if he had lived there forever. And in the morning, when the sun returned, the bookstore would wake once more. So would he, quietly, steadily, as though he belonged. There was no single moment when Hemingway became famous. No fanfare, no big reveal. Just a gradual murmurous series of quiet clicks, reposts, soft smiles passed from screen to screen. It began on a rainy Thursday. The kind of day when the clouds sagged low and the sea air curled into every window pane. The bookstore, lit in soft yellows and dusky shadows, smelled of old cedar, cinnamon tea, and the ink of new catalogues. The kind of comforting grey that invited people to linger. That afternoon, a travel blogger passing through town wandered into Willow and Fern with a book-shaped umbrella and camera in tow. She had meant to stay only a few minutes, enough to escape the drizzle and buy a regional map. But she lingered when she spotted him. Hemingway was curled up between two poetry anthologies near the window. His fur blended with the worn spines around him, one paw draped over Pablo Neruda. The blogger, a soft-spoken woman named Eloise, knelt silently, snapped a photo. Then a short video of him yawning as the rain tapped against the glass. She labeled it, "The Literary Cat Who Sleeps on Sonnets." Posted it between shots of seaside cliffs and latte art by nightfall. The reel had been reshared over 5,000 times. By morning, 10,000. They called him the bookstore cat, the poet's familiar, the guardian of page and paw. Instagram. Followers surged when Willow and Fern reluctantly made an account. At first, just out of curiosity. Then, more regularly, when someone sent in fan art. A child in Ohio had drawn Hemingway with feathered wings, sleeping atop a drifting cloud of alphabet letters. A teenager from Portugal wrote, "I wish I had a Hemingway in my corner of the world." People began sending books addressed to him. Yes. To him, envelopes arrived marked for Hemingway, head of fiction, or ATN, the most distinguished cat of literature. A publisher from New York mailed a special edition of The Old Man and the Sea with a handwritten note. "We thought he might enjoy this." Soon, Hemingway's photo was displayed not only near the cash register, but framed in small literary cafes across the region. Stores began offering limited Hemingway bookmarks, his profile silhouetted against a stack of novels, with the words, "In Cats We Trust." On rain-smeared mornings, visitors stopped outside Willow and Fern, pressing their noses gently against the glass, hoping for even the smallest glimpse. Some caught his tail flicking behind the philosophy section. Others spotted him asleep beneath the stool by the cash wrap, his chin resting in a sunbeam that only arrived mid-afternoon. The town began leaning into the magic of him. Children told tall tales that curved into wonder. "He knows if it's a good book just by sitting on it," one said. "I saw him move a copy of Hamlet to the mystery section," another whispered. One evening, a girl named Clara swore that Hemingway had chosen her book for her. She had been pacing the aisles indecisively until he brushed once against her leg and paused beside a dog-eared copy of The Secret Garden. She clutched it like treasure, eyes wide with reverence. From then on, parents began asking librarians if they stocked Hemingway-approved titles. A small sign went up on a display rack inside the store, curated by Cat. Above it, a photo of him half dozing beside a stack that included Wind in the Willows, Black Beauty, The Velveteen Rabbit, And curiously Winnie, the Pooh Dot teachers, began bringing classes not for author readings, but to visit the manager. Elderly patrons who hadn't stepped inside a shop in years came just to see Hemingway. One woman, named Edith, arrived during a midsummer drizzle, walking slowly onto canes. She cornered Margot behind the till and said, "I was told he might bring me luck." Margot pointed kindly to the history section, where Hemingway was snoozing against a back issue of the Strand magazine. Edith sat on a nearby chair, pulled out a knitting project, and didn't move for an hour. She didn't even glance at the books, just sat peacefully beside him. When she stood to leave, she murmured, "First time I've felt steady in weeks." Her needles clicked softly as she left. Hemingway accepted the praise with the kind of dignity only cats know how to bear. With a blink, a flick of the ear, a casual rearranging of limbs that suggested he had always known this would happen. Not that he seemed to care. Margot started noticing small miracles. Weekdays felt fuller. The winter lull seemed shorter. Donations to the bookstore's literacy fund increased, especially after Hemingway's likeness was printed on a limited line of tote bags and enamel pins. One night, the shop's voicemail received a call from a small local band asking if Hemingway might be available for a music video shoot. "We just want him to be himself," they said, "maybe on a velvet chair beside a record player." Groups began visiting just to host book circles in his presence. Even if he didn't join, even if he simply watched from the shelf behind the checkout counter, it was enough. Rose Wren's the cafe next door named a chai latte after him. The Hemingway blend. It consisted of black tea, honey, steamed oat milk, and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Made for napping afternoons and overly poetic moods, the menu declared, on a chalkboard by the entrance to Willow and Fern. Staff would occasionally leave notes beneath the day's hours. Some days read, "Hemingway recommends escaping into a fairy tale." Others, "He's napping behind gardening this morning. She." The bookstore became a kind of beacon, the kind you stumbled toward when life felt too loud. Tourists left notes on the community board thanking Hemingway for existing. One simply said, "I needed this today. Please tell him." And so he remained unbothered by fame, unmoved by followers. He still chose where to nap, which displays were worthy of his whiskers, which spines might bear the grace of a stretched paw. He belonged to no one, and yet belonged to them all, and in sleepy corners of the world. Draped in the perfume of paper and pine and memory, Hemingway kept watch. A cat in a bookstore. A story with no end, just page after page after page. It began with an absence. Not dramatic, not abrupt, simply a quiet sort of missing. One morning, the rain pattered against the windows of Willow and Fern as it always did, and the floor warmed in stripes of honey-colored light, but Hemingway wasn't in his usual spot behind the Atlas cart. No glimpses of him in the folds of the fleece blanket near the local history shelf, no tail brushing past ankles, no soft thump onto the radiator ledge above the patterned armchair. At first, no one said anything. These things happened. Hemingway came and went, as cats do. Maybe he'd slipped out into the morning mist, or found a different patch of pavement warmed by scattered sun. Margot made her tea and hummed the way she always did, but she noticed by noon, murmurs started. "Haven't seen him today. He's not in the window. No, not behind psychology either. Someone left a tiny bowl of creme fraiche behind gardening, just in case." It remained untouched. The second day passed more slowly. Customers returned to double-check his hiding places. Children wandered to the edge of shadowy corners, whispering his name, Dustpaw Hemingway. The shop grew just a decibel quieter, as though bracing under a hush that hadn't fully arrived. Behind the counter, Margot stared at the fleece square in the poetry nook, still perfectly folded, still cold to the touch. She tried not to tell herself what that meant. By the afternoon, search efforts had unofficially begun. Theo walked the back alley behind Rose Wren's, calling softly. Laurel checked the abandoned greenhouse 3 doors down. Flyers weren't exactly posted, but someone scribbled his name on the corner of the Daily Specials chalkboard, seen Hemingway. Tell Margot. Word moved quickly in a town like theirs. Staff from the post office passed the news like a rolled-up letter. The barista from Morning Tide Cafe slipped into Willow and Fern with a tin of sardines. Just in case, she said, gently, setting them near the base of the returns trolley. Evening brought a heaviness that paper and wax candles couldn't melt. That night, Margot sat in the storeroom with the door half cracked to the rain. The fleece blanket was folded across her knees. She told herself she was just resting, not waiting. Still, she listened for paws against pavement, for a soft grumble under the bench by the emergency exit. But the night passed without footsteps. On the third morning, something shifted. Margot didn't open the store right away. Instead, she slipped her keys into her coat pocket and walked the back alleys, ones she hadn't seen clearly in months. She paused near the broken lattice behind the laundry depot, checked under cabinets in the deserted flower shed, called his name just once. No one answered until, near noon, while returning through the passage behind Rose Wren's. She heard a rustle. It came from beneath the cafe, where a basement access hatch had half collapsed in the last storm and never been nailed shut. Someone had dragged over a planter to hide the gap. But the noise, it was too deliberate to be wind. She called out softly, waited, nothing. But she saw it then, a faint shift in shadow, a glint of whisker, 2 eyes, dull but unmistakable. He was trapped. How long he'd been there, no one could be certain. Possibly most of that first day, possibly longer. It took 3 people and a crowbar to pry open the panel enough. Laurel cried when they pulled him out, matted, limp, but blinking, alive. His body cold to the touch, one hind leg stiff with injury. But his tail twitched in protest the moment someone tried to tuck a towel around him. Margot held him close, all the way back, one hand pressed over his fragile boned back like a tether to the beating world. The bookstore door opened into warmth and hush and a flood of relief so thick it rose behind eyelids unbidden. They made him a bed behind the history section, a nest of wool, crushed velvet and heavy old coats. Someone lit a candle in the tea nook. Someone else posted an update on the store's board. He's home. By sunset, the bookstore had filled not with customers, but with neighbors. A second-hand vet from 3 blocks over checked his paw, muttering promises of recovery. Kids drew welcome back signs and tapped them to the windows, their rain cloud crayoning smears of blue and gold across butcher paper, and outside, yellow ribbons appeared, tied hastily around lampposts, tree branches, even the handlebars of the town librarian's bike. The old baker down the street made lemon anise muffins, shaped them into tiny pea-embossed domes, and called them Heming-UF-fins. By morning, half the town had eaten one or delivered one. Hemingway didn't move much. The next few days, he slept mostly. Deep, bone-hollow sleeps that seemed to stretch beyond the room. But when he dreamed, his tail twitched with memory. His paws curled across the patched quilt like he remembered, like he knew he was somewhere meant. The community kept vigil in their way, soft songs by the register. Cup after cup of tea, brewed extra strong, left steaming near his resting place. One child brought him a sweater she'd knit herself, too wide and full of dropped stitches. They draped it over the basket like armor. "Just until he's better," she said. He began healing, not in great strides, but in glimmers. One eye opened a little more. One toe flexed to claim the blanket. After a week, he licked a sliver of smoked trout from Margot's fingers and settled his chin into the crook of her wrist like thanks. Somewhere along the way, someone painted his likeness above the reading nook, whiskered, wrapped in a cloak of old stories, crown of bookmarks askew above his loyal, careful gaze. It stayed there long after he began walking again. He returned to the windowsill one rainy morning, limp, barely noticeable, tail curling with old pride. He blinked once as the town came into view, watched a school bus pass below, nuzzled once into the cushion and yawned. He belonged once again, fully, and willow and fern exhaled in a way it hadn't for days, maybe weeks, because some absences stretch the air too thin, but some returns quiet, fragile, unmistakable, fill it back to the walls. He aged the way old books do, softly, without asking attention. One day, you just notice the spine bends more when opened, the margins stay a little quieter. So it was with Hemingway. Over time, his movements slowed and his naps deepened. He still roamed the aisles, still took his place beside the register or curled near biographies. But now he did so with thoughtfulness, as if memorizing the path beneath his paws. He didn't leap to high places anymore. Preferred the ground, a soft footstool, a thick cushion pressed to the south-facing window. Customers commented on this, only gently. "He seems more contemplative these days," someone whispered once. Margot only smiled, brushing hair from her eyes, and said, "He's always been an old soul." Summer melted into fall. The air carried spice and ocean salt. And a new volunteer arrived at the shop, an aspiring librarian named Callum, with ink-stained sleeves and careful hands. On his first day, he asked, timidly, "Is it true a cat runs this place?" Margot pointed to a sleepy silhouette under the atlas shelf and said with a grin, "Every decision has whiskers behind it. We just implement them." Callum nodded solemnly and began shelving historical fiction. But that evening, when sweeping under the reading armchairs, he found a small pile of tidy, deliberate objects to plush mice. A curled ribbon from a bookmark and a folded receipt bearing the words, "Hemingway's pick." He didn't ask again. The presence of the bookstore cat became something quietly generational. Teenagers who had once stumbled in reluctantly following. Their parents now brought dates. "You have to meet him," they'd say over hot chocolate. "He's kind of famous." In winter, grandparents brought grandchildren bundled in scarves and nostalgia, telling them about the first time we met Hemingway, like he'd been there forever, a children's author. After visiting Willow and Fern for a reading, was so charmed by Hemingway that she penned an illustrated tale in his honor. The bookstore cat who could read with his heart. The story followed a quiet feline who helped lost readers find the stories they didn't know they were looking for. It painted the cat not as a mascot, but as a guardiana creature who understood without explanation. The publishers sent 50 copies. Margot donated 16 to local schools and placed the rest in the front window, next to a plush replica made by a local artist. Visitors asked if he posed for it. "No," Margot said. "He just inspired it." Teachers began including quiet time at the bookstore in their lesson plans. The children would sit cross-legged beneath the window, drawing or journaling, and from the corner, Hemingway would sit, half-curled, his presence a sort of permission to be calm and alert all at once. The ripple effect stretched even further. Towns nearby, those that had once struggled to keep small shops open, began to explore something new. A library in Emmingstone adopted a rescued orange tabby and named her Bronte. A small garden shop in Winmore gave honorary staff badges to their three-legged mutt, Volis. It wasn't about profit. It wasn't even about charm. It was about presence, comfort, a reminder that lives, even small, simple ones, can change the feeling of a space. At Willow and Fern, the economic impact was noted on paper. Of course, attendance rose. Winter dips became plateaus. Book club memberships surged, and events were often at capacity. But figures were never the point. Margot summed it up in an interview once. Hemingway didn't bring us more business. He gave us something worth staying for. By this time, he had acquired a few more dignities. A hand-painted sign above his favorite cushion reading, "Still considering your literary choices." A crocheted collar he wore exactly once before storing it deliberately inside the reference drawer. A bronze library card issued in his name, framed near the till. And though he reigned in silence, a low warmth seemed to expand anywhere he rested. Families who hadn't visited in months stopped by just to say hello. Teenagers, once too shy to speak, started sitting cross-legged near his cushion, reading aloud without prompting. One man even proposed to his partner beside the poetry shelf, with Hemingway snoozing nearby like a blessing. Some people ask why it mattered so much, why a single cat could shift the heart of a whole place. Perhaps it wasn't just Hemingway himself, but what he allowed people to feel. He asked for nothing, gave little in the way of traditional affection. But he stayed, quietly. And in doing so, he taught them something about the kinds of loyalty that arrive without performance. When he stopped leaping to his narrower sill, someone quietly built a ramp. When his eyes began to water more with the change of seasons, the vet came to him. When he had a tooth pulled and refused dinner, a town-wide brainstorm emerged from regulars on what soft food he would tolerate, because that's what love looks like sometimes, not in what's shouted, but in what is quietly maintained. Over time, he became more than a cat. He was a ceremony, a weather vane of stillness in a spinning world. Hearts were hung gently on his routines. And through all these moments, early morning nose nudges near the local author's shelf, tail twitches during poetry readings, long naps among unsold maps, Hemingway remained a quiet echo of something sacred. He chose them over and over again, and in return, they built something enduring. A kind of faith stitched not in rules, but in freckles of warmth, settled dust, and pawprints forever ghosting the shelves. He didn't rewrite their world, he simply walked through it quiet enough for them to hear their own stories again. There is a moment just before the bookstore opens, when the world holds its breath. The light filters in through the windows like warm tea poured slowly, and the dust dances as if remembering something soft. The keys turn in the door, and the chime sounds above the threshold, notes so familiar. Even the floorboards seemed to sigh. That morning, the chime rang and no shadow stirred from beneath the poetry shelf. No outline shifted near the beam of sun just beginning to stretch across the atlas section. The cushion near the register remained undisturbed, its indent faint and undisturbed, as if waiting for something to return. Margot unlocked the door slowly her hands lingering longer than they used to. Behind her, Theo carried a box of spring releases. Neither of them spoke. There had been no announcement, no sign hung in the window, just a quiet understanding carried by the people who'd watched Hemingway grow older, slower, sleep longer, and then sleep completely. He passed in the night. They think curled in his usual place, beneath the nook where pages turn slower and the lamplight never stings the eyes. It was peaceful, the kind of goodbye that doesn't hurt immediately. It echoes, instead, quietly, constantly, like an empty space in a symphony. No crowds arrived, no fanfare, only the silence that follows when something essential has ended. And yet, he had left behind so many traces, soft anchors in the heart of willow and fern. The quilt he favored folded neatly, the smudge mark beneath the biography shelf where his side had leaned too many times to count. The wool mouse, grayed from years of disregard and affection, both tucked away where only he knew to look. In the days that followed, a brass plaque appeared on the window seat. Its inscription was simple, in memory of Hemingway, guardian of stories. Someone had drawn his likeness in ink just beneath the texter, small figure with closed eyes, tail curled, as though still mid-dash dream. No one needed to be told how to grieve him. Some brought flowers, lilacs, mostly the kind that grew in Mrs. Castor's garden, where he used to sleep on quiet afternoons. Some left treats wrapped in tissue, though none would ever go touched again. A child left a single catnip sachet with a card that read, "For Hemingway." The misspelling was not corrected. It felt right somehow. Slowly, rituals formed. Staff would light a candle on the register each morning before flipping the sign to open. Margot rewrote the chalkboard greeting at the front door. "Come in, borrow some quiet." He would have wanted you to stay a while. The fleece blanket remained untouched where he'd last slept. No one dared move it. The bookstore continued, but now it carried him in its bones. The pages seemed to whisper a little louder. The corners held a warmth that couldn't be explained. His memory was not mourned with tears alone, but with reverence, with extra care when sliding books onto shelves, with the slower sip of tea while watching rain trace paths down the window, with the habit, strange but enduring, of still glancing toward the cushion near travel to check if he'd returned. He hadn't disappeared. Not really, Margot spoke it best, folding a stack of poetry books beside the cash wrap when someone quietly asked, "Do you miss him?" She looked up with a smile lined in light and replied, "He's everywhere. You just have to know where to listen." Other cats came, eventually strays that circled the alley, rescue kittens peeking into open doors, but none stayed. Not because they weren't welcome, but because there was only ever one Hemingway, and the space he filled had settled, not closed. It accepted memory as part of ambience, not something to be replaced. The illustrated book, once written in his honor, sold out again and again. Requests came from as far as Tokyo and Portugal, asking if they would reprint it. One edition bore a new dedication page, for those we read beside, even if only for a chapter. On one especially cold morning, an elderly couple sat beside the radiator with their matching mugs of tea and a volume of Frost between them. The woman glanced over her shoulder toward where Hemingway used to sleep and whispered, "He's still here, love." The man, without turning, simply nodded. "Of course he is. Years may pass. The ivy might climb a little higher around the window panes, the creak in the eastern flooring might soften beneath repair. But in the hush of willow and fern, when the light falls just right and someone turns a page with reverence, his presence comes winged in silence. Maybe you, too, have known something like him. A friend you didn't choose, but who came anyway. Who offered no promises, no packaged affection, just presence. Just a gaze that saw you. A choice, again and again, to stay where safety lived. Because some stories do not end. They settle, they slip into the breath of places and live there, waiting. So if you visit the bookstore, a rainy day perhaps, when the light is shy and the floor still smells of worn cedar, sit for a while, read softly and listen very closely. Because some corners remember how to purr, and some love, however quietly it arrived, purrs back.